Welcome to the Priority Traffic Podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Ben. Our mission is to provide our audience with practical information that can be put to work immediately in order to give yourself the tactical advantage on your everyday decisions.
Hey everybody, this is Chris. Welcome to today's show. We're excited to interview Keith Hanks, a retired firefighter and EMT with 21 years of experience, who now dedicates his life to advocating for mental health and well-being in the first responder community. Keith has faced numerous challenges in his life, including complex PTSD, but his love and devotion to his fellow first responders and the community remains strong. He focuses on mental illness, substance abuse recovery, and suicide awareness. Among his many accomplishments, Keith has built an international support group on Facebook, participated in Deconstructing Stigma Project, and completed a feature-length documentary on PTSD for the first responders. Join us as we explore Keith's journey in his advocacy work and the valuable insight he has to offer on mental health and the resilience in the first responder community.
Keith, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing good, Chris. Thanks for having me here today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on. Everybody, I'm with a fellow, formerly a firefighter, but current advocate for firefighter mental illness, awareness, PTSD, firefighter well-being, Keith Hanks. He's doing us a pleasure coming on this June day in honor of June being PTSD awareness for first responders, the month. So, Keith, it's a pleasure to have you, sir.
And it's an important month too, so I'm glad that we're doing this in June. PTSD is very close to my heart and something that I kind of give myself to. So it's an honor to be able to talk about it today.
Absolutely. Well, with that being said, I'd like to, jump right in. A couple weeks ago, we discussed, resilience in the first responderhood. And I think getting an idea of what that term means, because there seems to be a lot of jargon bouncing out of other communities into the fire service, right? Like all these wellness terms, and one that seems to be crucial and, capital R, resilience, is popping up in a lot more trainings lately, and it's being just talked about. And, maybe you could give us an idea of what resilience looks like from your perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes, right? When it comes to resilience versus like coping or coping skills.
Sure.
And, for me, there's always been, I think most of us all have coping skills. We're all able to kind of cope with a situation, specifically like with trauma, right? Mm-hmm. For me, though, resilience is that almost like automatic ability. It's that you get knocked down, you get back up. You get knocked down, you get back up. And it's based in actual healing, not coping, is for me when it comes to resilience. And that is actually facing, whatever it is you've been through, specifically, I tend to deal with like trauma stuff.
Right.
Dealing with those traumas and everything affiliated with them, the feelings, the emotions, the memories, the body language, all of that. When you actually heal with it instead of cope with it, which is okay, we have to survive.
Can I stop you right there just for a sec? Let's talk. Sure. Let's say what is coping?
Well, in the fire service, we like to drink, right?
Absolutely.
So there's unhealthy, and then there's healthy coping.
Okay.
And I think some people tend to think that maybe not dealing with something is avoidance. Mm-hmm. Like it's like black and white, right? Like where it's like if you're not dealing with it, you're avoiding it.
Right.
That is actually coping, and it's actually a form of healthy coping, but it's not necessarily resilience. There's a lot of good coping, there's a lot of bad coping, and there's extremes within each, I think.
Gotcha.
To which I've definitely experienced both, and I still use coping skills. Grounding is a bit of a coping skill.
Okay.
And but for resilience, honestly, what I always preach with people, and every time I talk about this, which is a lot,
right?
The big thing is the healing part. The healing part, and actually facing the trauma or the situation in its entirety is where you build that resiliency, and where it sort of becomes an automatic thing.
Right.
And that's kind of the difference between a coping mechanism, which are helpful and good, and true resiliency, I feel.
Okay, so it sounds like we have good and bad coping mechanisms. We can establish habits that go either way. right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes some are what you would say short term, like they can work here, work now, maybe 3 or 4 days, maybe a week or two, but at some point that becomes a chronic issue, and it's not very long term,
Right.
And then we would have like the long term coping mechanisms, which in general would be more positive than negative, perhaps.
Typically, I mean,
if we're choosing, supportive stuff there.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I would think long term, a more positive, healthy coping skill, could be more long term. But there are, the unhealthy ones that get used long term. But yeah, I guess on a term of healthy stuff, yes.
Got it. Perfect. So resilience in the firefighter, right? So now we're talking about, oh man, so many things.
So many.
Right. How did you get into your specific seat where you're talking to me about this? Like what, let's look back at young Keith, and how did you even find out you want to be a firefighter, right? What was it like growing up for you?
That's a story that started a long time, almost 45 years ago. It's
sure.
So I grew up in a firefighting and military family.
Okay.
Firefighting and military on my mother's side, and military on my father's side.
Okay.
And I can actually, in the fire service, can trace my roots back to 1875, which is really cool.
Yeah.
But I grew up, I was like immersed in it. It was almost drowning at points, because there was so much discipline. So I always knew I was going to be a firefighter. It wasn't that I wanted or didn't want to do, but the other options in life didn't always present themselves or were encouraged. So growing up around the fire station, growing up around what I would later learn was unhealthy coping skills in my family,
right?
Generational trauma and all that stuff. It sort of molded me into who I ended up becoming when I got on the job. And with my own, and we can touch on this more later, but with my own childhood trauma, it really left my adolescence leading into my teen years with no identity.
Sure.
And I ended up getting into the fire service, I got sworn in 2 days after my 18th birthday while still in high school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So here I am.
Yeah. Wow.
No idea who I am. Very confused, already semi-traumatized. And I get an identity put at me. And the same night I get sworn in, I go to my first fire. So then I'm actually part of this camaraderie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, here you go. Here's your self-esteem back. Here's your confidence. And so I rolled with it.
Heck yeah.
And it was good for a while.
Yeah. It's a new environment, right? Like it's coming into the fire service is a big deal, right? You might not garner respect from people immediately, but you've stepped up into, quite the career path, and, it has a lot of respect and admiration given to the title, right? Not everybody always maintains that, but you get a lot of pressure put on you right away. And you mentioned bringing basically a not necessarily broken version of yourself into the fire service, but a conditioned, version that.
Right.
How did you find coming into the fire service felt as that, right? Like, because now you're transforming a little.
So it was, it's weird, right? Like I always tell people, it wasn't a hard transition for me because I always knew I knew I had no choice. I knew it was going to be the fire service for me or military, and that didn't work out. So it was because it was a small department. It was my family's department, and everyone kind of knew me. It was sort of like just expected that Keith was going to be around the firehouse working one day.
Okay.
And, it was one of those things where in the 90s, things were, we had a lot more fires. We didn't do the medical side wasn't as prevalent back then. Men were men and sheep were scared. We had hip boots, long coats, and we didn't use our air packs. So it was a different time.
Oh, for sure.
You had to live up to this expectation. You came in, and I came in from a family of really tough men who did this job expecting to have to act the same way.
Right. What year was it when you entered?
It was December of 96 when I got on.
Okay. Gotcha.
So 27 years ago.
Yeah.
which is a long time, especially when you're only almost 45. And but it was a different time, and it was a good fit. It felt right because it was able, and this is kind of the messed up part.
Sure.
Right. Is I already had traumas in my life,
right?
Personal traumas. And now at a very impressionable age, I am now doing a job which is dangerous.
Dangerous,
which is
right?
Feeding me more trauma, but on a professional level. But it's pushing away all the stuff that happened to me as a kid. It's making it so I'm not dealing with it. Oh, well,
right.
This is happening now. So now I got to go deal with other people's trauma.
Sure.
Deal with this repetitive professional trauma. So it kind of pushed everything aside, which felt good for a while until it no longer kept pushed away.
Yeah. The pressure of the stuff in the shadow kind of got a little bit stronger. And it, I think it's profound that you mention it, but when we ignore it, it doesn't go anywhere. Right.
No.
Even if we're busy and doing other things, even if things in life are going pretty swimmingly, right? If it's never addressed, it doesn't go anywhere.
So it's always there.
Yeah, exactly. So were you pretty fit coming into the fire service to start, or how was your fitness? Just curious as a guy.
So when I first got out of high school, I was not in the best of shape. That's actually why I couldn't get in the Marines.
Okay.
There was a bunch of us that tried getting in the Marines, and not only was I flat-footed, so I got 4 after right away.
Yep.
But I was pretty chubby, and but I could do it. I passed all the physical things, and I was actually one of the fastest when it came to all the time tests and stuff, like gear tests, SCBA tests and all that. But I quickly lost my weight. I actually was only 6'1" when I graduated high school. I was what I am now, which is 6'5" by the end of that summer. So in 3 months, I grew 4 inches.
4 inches in 3 months.
Yeah. And so I also lost some of that chub, and I realized, well, I'm a tall guy. I should get in shape. So probably within the first year, I got myself into pretty good shape, and I realized that this is career-wise, this is what I want to do. And so I started testing, in places like New York City and taking the Massachusetts Civil Service test, and really wanted to make this what I did. This is all I wanted to do.
Amazing. What was the fitness culture like when you got in? And obviously you're a rookie, you got, probationary year. How was that culture when you in 1996? My dad was a fireman in that period, and I don't ever remember him going to the gym.
Yeah, it was, I would say overall though, compared to and I don't mean this towards anyone in particular, but back then compared to today, there was definitely more fit people.
Okay.
I think the culture has gotten a little lax with physical fitness, but you're right. I didn't really know anyone who went to the gym. They also didn't sit and eat a box of donuts every day, so
sure, fair enough.
They were definitely more fit, and there was definitely a pressure when I was going through the academy, my initial training, and then the academy. Hey, you got to stay in shape. You got to be able to do this. There's going to be times where you're going to be called upon to really give your max. And so it was a little bit more enforced.
Gotcha.
Back then, I think.
All right. So 1996, you're a rookie in the fire service, right? You're 6'4", leaning out. How was getting your feet wet in the fire service? What did you know you were experiencing trauma type stuff then, or were you just a young dude pushing through?
So I always tell the story. I allude to the first fire I had.
Okay.
The night I got sworn in. Which was
first
huge.
night.
You get on as a call guy, on call volunteer guy. And that's a big deal, right?
Right.
And so I'm working as an on-call guy, and the first couple months are lots of fires. We go to a couple accidents. I end up going to an accident where a classmate died. So there's some trauma, but I'm not looking at it that way because the culture is suck it up. If you're going to do this job, you have to be able to do this job.
Right.
And I come from it in my family. So things are going pretty good. And March of 97, where my department's actually hosting an academy class on incident command. Okay. And it's a Sunday morning. It's the last day of the class. Our pages, we had these old minute one pagers that were like bricks. Okay. It's sitting on my nightstand next to my bed. It goes off for a building fire with people trapped. And of course, I immediately swallow my throat, and everything is like, oh shit, because I'm on the first truck. I know I'm going to be on the first truck there because I'm stationed at the downtown station. Okay. And I knew my truck was going to be first too. So long story, extremely abridged. I get to the station and we head off, and our fire chief signs the route because we were, strictly at that time an on-call department with a full-time chief.
Okay.
And he signs the route to the house. As we're responding, it's 4.5 minute response time. He signs the route, confirms people trapped, says he's going in.
Your
Radio
chief.
silence. Our chief.
Wow. Okay.
Radio silence.
Yeah.
Hear nothing. They can't raise him. They can't get him back on the radio. We get there. The house is fully involved. I get up the driveway. I was sitting in an assigned seat for like water supply.
Okay.
The guy across the doghouse from me in the back of the truck was on the attack line seat. So I had to get out, 100-foot driveway. They drive up. I walk up. My first sight is what appears to be a pile of steaming blankets being carried towards me by a couple of EMTs.
Okay.
It ends up not being that. It ends up being a burnt human body.
Sure.
As I smell that, I look to my right, and against the garage is an elderly man bleeding from the wrists, being attended to by a cop. 2 seconds later, I look straight ahead of me, and my fire chief dives out the window with flames behind him. That is what ends up being my first fatal fire 4 months into my career. Now, that's a bad call, right? And it's like lots of different parts.
Yeah. Yeah.
The part I always tell people, which was pivotal, was the critical incident stress meeting that week. This is where it all set everything in motion. My mindset became concrete in what I had to do. We all meet.
Yeah.
There's almost all men. There might have been one female cop there, but all men. And the person running it is like, hey, you guys had this fire. Someone died.
Right.
Someone else almost died, and you almost lost your fire chief. Does anyone want to talk about how that affected you and what you feel about it? Nobody shared anything. These are all people I grew up around. These are my family. These are people who've been at family barbecues, who mentored me.
Sure.
Lieutenants, captains, chiefs. Nobody said anything. I looked around that room and I was like, so this is how it's got to be. Because if I share something, I'm out.
Wow.
And 2 seconds after that, or within, a couple seconds after that, was, okay, guys, well, coffee and donuts in the back. And no one ever talked about it. And that was my first experience with a very, very traumatic situation that nobody wanted to talk about. No one was dealing with. And for the most part, everybody just went back and drank beer.
Wow. So you're a new guy. You just went through, from your story, a pretty, I would say, horrific, call experience. And then you get back. So you did have a critical incident opportunity. So that's good. Was that common then, you think?
No, I mean, they definitely weren't handled as often as they should have been, as maybe they are now.
Okay.
So to have a system back then was definitely a big deal just to have it.
And then nobody even said anything, not even a whisper.
Not the way I remember it.
Wow. If you were able to speak up in that moment, I don't know if you can share on this or not, but what would you have said?
I don't know, because I always tell people I knew I was going to see bad shit. I was prepared when I went in that I knew I was going to see bad shit. What I wasn't prepared for was that kind of situation where I wasn't given the platform to be able to deal with what I saw or was going to see.
Okay.
There was no support for that. That's the debilitating part of this job is that support that isn't always there. It's not that you're going to see bad things. I think we all know that.
Right.
And, that was the hard part. It was like, wow, I didn't think I was going to see this quick. Never mind the fact that when I was going there, I thought I was going to have to go in and pull my chief out of the building.
Yeah.
It was a lot of different parts that there was no platform to discuss. And my story is not rare. I mean,
right.
I talk to people all the time and it's, that was exactly my story. And it's like, oh, holy crap.
Right. Yeah. It's your first day, but it's been going on all the time. It continues to happen. It just happened and it will happen again. Maybe not in your city, but it's people are experiencing it all over the place. And I think you're right, though. We didn't ever, in my experience, it was never impressed upon me what, maybe what you will see is going to be heavy and visually stimulating and, for lack of, saying it's traumatic, maybe, because that ranges for people, but they never said, here's a few tools. This might help you someday. And I think, and that's kind of where you and I line up, is where I want to also, make sure that the people coming into the fire service are gifted at least a guide or a book on like, hey, we know you're tough and you're tough for being here. You made it this far. here's a skill set that nobody's ever told you about that you need, and it will likely save your life.
Bingo.
And so, it doesn't sound like your culture coming through was super onto this, but it sounds like this might have been an opportunity for you to find something in you. Is that, that how that came about? Or did you just say, I'm not talking about any of this?
I literally said, I'm not talking about this. And it gave me another excuse at another point in my life to not deal with trauma. And not that I was calling it trauma, not that I was.
Right, of course.
None of us, I think, were educated back then on that. But
right.
It was a way for me not to deal with it. And because there's so much generational trauma in my family, I kind of felt like I had to do that. And like we said earlier, if you don't deal with this stuff, it will eventually come back. And come to find out, it was doing it throughout my career, but then eventually really reared its head later in life.
When you say generational trauma, I'm sure plenty of people can put two and two together what that might mean, but are you able to expand on that just a little bit, just so the listeners have an understanding of where we're coming from when we use that term?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my particular case, both my grandfathers were sergeants in World War II.
Okay.
And they came back from the war back then. They didn't deal with this. It was like, I think they knew, hey, you just saw your buddies die or you witnessed civilians dying, whatever.
Yeah.
That's bad, but they just called it shell shock, maybe even battle fatigue back then. And I know that at least my mother's father was, battle alcoholism, was abusive. And so even before him, though, there was that sort of trauma happening. And so you pass it down generation to generation. Each generation is growing up in this, and it affects us. We don't realize it's affecting us because until you go out in the world and you realize this isn't the norm. Not every household has necessarily this sort of generational trauma to this degree.
Sure.
You don't realize how bad it really was. And so it gets passed down through generations of not dealing with what you experience in life, not dealing with the emotional power, not dealing with how your body records all this stuff, and it gets passed down and people act a certain way who aren't healed. If you're not healed, you act a certain way, and you tend to give that to the younger generation, especially the kids. And I was an only child.
Okay.
And so I took quite a bit of hits.
Wow. So you say when we talk about trauma, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but I think from a perspective of a first responder, right? It's the things that we witness, the things we smell, the things that kind of overtake our ability to cope with, right? We talked about coping. Is that something that we would call trauma, or, is there, it's hard to lump a lot, it's so expansive when it comes to defining things, and, trauma is something you can't really define, but how do we put our thumb on that just in this context, would you say?
So I've read a lot of stuff, and obviously I have my own experience with things. And one of the things I've realized is that trauma isn't necessarily defined by the event itself. If that was the case, everyone would have PTSD.
Right.
Trauma is our internal response to it.
Okay.
To a given, and this is, again, my opinion, there are some of the medical community that believes this too, but
sure.
It's really your internal and biological and psychological response to a situation, a given event or series of events that considers something that makes something a trauma. And as time has gone on, especially in my healing and recovery, I've realized that is incredibly true with me.
Okay.
And I say that in regards to being on a crew with 3 or 4 other guys and being at a situation, having it affect me a certain way, and having it affect someone else not the same way, and having it not affect someone at all. And we all witness the same thing. It's all the same event. But because we all have different past, maybe generational trauma or not,
sure,
it affects us internally. And that's when it really kind of registers as a trauma. And so in the first responder world, it gets a little dicey because there are people, significant amounts, that can go through the same call as someone else and not be affected by it in a traumatic way that someone may, based on several factors.
Okay. Gotcha.
And so that's where it gets a little tricky sometimes, because people are like, well, it didn't affect me. And they may be being completely honest.
Right.
But it's not the event necessarily. It's what that event does inside.
Okay. It's kind of our internal interpretation of that experience from our collected experiences. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. I think it's everything. It's like if you grow up in New England, like I do.
Sure.
You're more acclimated to having really harsh winters and kind of shitty summers.
Right.
But people down south and maybe like, the Mexican border of Texas, they wouldn't be able to deal with 3 feet of snow on Memorial Day.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean? But
Absolutely.
that's like, it's the same thing with psychological stuff and trauma.
Okay.
Where if you've got stuff all through your life, different things, upbringings, poverty, whatever it may be, certain events are going to affect you a certain way. And I've realized this as I've healed, that this is really why so many things affected me. And why there's such an astronomical amount of trauma that I've had to heal from, because there was so much passed down or that I experienced at a very young age that set the stage.
Yeah, you inherited a handful. You got your own, and then you thrust yourself into the fire service, and now you've accumulated whatever else, right? So, and that type of stuff, when I think when we say we don't heal from it or process it, it doesn't go anywhere. It just builds up, right?
It festers, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's like a magnet just collecting all the metal around you, all the fibers and everything. It just picks everything up.
Wow.
And eventually it's got to go somewhere. And that's why, like you said earlier, that's why it's so important to give these first responders, the tools and the resources to be able to deal with this stuff as it's coming up, and the support system to be able to do it.
Right. So I'm really curious as to what got you, from new firefighter who's like, I'm not going to say anything. Do you remember when you're like, oh my God, I have to talk to somebody? Like, do you remember that point where you reached out, or was that, not necessarily anytime soon in your career?
It was definitely later on. And, so I stuck with doing municipal fire and EMS. I also got into privatized EMS. So I was working in some of the bigger cities out here. And
Gotcha.
So I was seeing a lot, and it eventually built up, and probably I really started feeling the effects and realized it was affecting my family. Probably 2008 to 2010 was really when I was like, oh shit, something's not right. I'm not handling things. I'm angry. I'm pissed. I'm smashing stuff. People scared of me. So, but the reception I got when I first started reaching out for help wasn't good, at least in my family and even parts of the job. And, it's upsetting at the time. It's upsetting, even now to say it, it's like you think back to, wow, that's crappy.
Right.
What a shitty brotherhood. But we didn't know. We weren't educated. So
we were unaware.
We didn't know trauma's only been treated in the psychological world for like 22 years, 25 years, maybe.
Very new.
And very new. And so really it was probably, I was almost 30 at that point. I was about 30.
Okay.
When I really realized.
About 12 years on the job?
Yeah, right around 12 years. It was about, like I said, 2008. So it was about 12 years. I realized I had to do something. But back then, there was a lot of factors. And oftentimes when I would go to get psychiatric help, my job wasn't taken into the equation. And I was very good at lying about my childhood because it was always brought up.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And we all lie about it, especially men men in the fire service or first responder world. We don't want to admit to that because that's vulnerability.
Yeah. So that, that brings up the big S word, right? Stigma, right?
Stigma.
Right. That's a super deep topic too, but how do you even think? Well, first, let's take a step back to before, you started realizing that it was about to pop. Like, how was your wellness, and what did the fire service train you on as far as wellness? Like, what was the base minimum? Like, hey, buddy, you better at least eat something today, or drink a water. Or did they ever say maybe stay hydrated? How was that culture for you?
The physical part was always reinforced. It was
right. That's the obvious one.
Yeah, that's the obvious one. But it was always, why don't you take a shift off? You look like you're stressed. Or I would express that things are really at their boiling point.
Okay.
Or in my case, because I end up going into, scheduled shift work on the department that was my family's.
Right.
There was a lot of information being shared with higher ranking people. And it made my job and my shift time and what I was dealing with harder because they knew something was up. And it was tough because it was always like, well, take some time. You're kind of pissing people off, or you're coming across like an asshole. And it's like, okay. And so it's tough because I wasn't sharing.
Right.
I was the asshole back then. And but I wasn't sharing. But at the same time, they weren't asking and we weren't educated.
Okay.
So it's a recipe for disaster. And it was never anything like, hey, you should go see a shrink, or, there wasn't even like a hypothetical, you want a hug?
Right.
You know what I mean? It wasn't even to that point. It was like, get your shit together and come back.
Just go get your shit together, because we know what that means. Yeah. Right. Especially when we're stressed. As a firefighter, coming through, being a young fella who valued fitness, were you sleeping and eating well coming into, your first 5 to 10 years on the job? Was that prioritized at all?
Sleep has always been an issue for me, but I was sleeping better, and I was definitely keeping up with my physical fitness and eating. But it was always, those are the first to go.
Right.
When you get to the point of, mental illness and mental health conditions. And I was no stranger to that for sure.
Okay. Gotcha. So it doesn't sound like the culture was really offering much at that point in time, right? Like, in the departments weren't putting you through trainings.
No, that's the weird part to think about it now is there was no formal training,
right,
short of what we need to know on like ambulance calls and stuff. For psychiatric stuff. It was always psychiatric emergencies. And it's like, looking back on it now, it was like, we need some preparedness for our own mental health and wellness, more importantly.
Yeah.
But there was none. Okay.
So we didn't have much to go with there. What would you say, you're 2000, what you said, 2008?
8-ish. Yeah,
8-ish. So what starts to bubble up or boil over at that point?
So I have all this trauma, right? I have all this stuff as a kid. I have the calls. I have a black cloud. 2003, going back a few years, 2003, I actually lose my first wife in a car accident.
Oh, wow.
And we have 2 young kids.
Okay.
So here I am, 24 years old at that point, kind of being thrown into being a single dad while being a first responder who has a astronomical amount of trauma. So things that kind of been boiling.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just boil over because I'm no longer able to cope.
Right.
I'm no longer, the resiliency isn't a word yet. We're not talking about resiliency.
Right.
I am coping the best I can on a literal hour-to-hour basis. And 2008 to 10 comes and I no longer can. And so I try to get help on like a general population way, like regular people in society, sort of psychiatric help.
Yeah.
Proves not to be helpful. Things get worse. I lose custody of my kids. I get kicked out of my house.
Oh, wow.
I start losing responsibilities in my jobs. I was always in the training division.
Mm-hmm.
I start losing responsibilities of that. I get passed over for promotions. Things really start to kind of come to a head. And, mind you, in this time, I'm having suicide attempts.
Okay.
And I kind of on and off battled alcohol and drug abuse.
Oh, wow.
And so all these things are kind of bouncing around. I'm not really getting real help because I'm not being honest when I go to get help.
Okay.
Because I feel like I can't. And so everything kind of falls apart around that time, 2010. Years go by. There's like separation in my family and stuff. And I'm just kind of not dealing with my stuff.
Right.
And really the turning point for me was when I reconnected with my biological father, who had been absent in my life for about 30 years.
Okay. Wow. How did that happen?
That was through a relative, through his youngest brother, reconnected us, told me he was dying of cancer. And I obviously was still pissed at him. And I was like, I don't care. Didn't realize this was going to be a very monumental moment in my life. And this is 2014 now.
Okay.
And so I reconnected with my father. We get like 6 months together. He dies a couple weeks before my next marriage with my current wife in 2014, summer of 2014. And it ends up sort of being the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I'm now with this new younger woman who is very open-minded.
Nice.
And sees this breakdown, gets to witness this breakdown. The department I'm on sees this breakdown, gets to witness this breakdown.
Yeah.
And they had previously had a line of duty death, and they had members need help. And so I go to a place specifically for first responders and finally start to get something.
Sure.
It's not handled right. It's not handled right, but it is handled better. And 2015 comes and I really start making strides when it comes to, okay, I want to heal.
Right.
I have had all this shit happen to me. I finally open up that there was some stuff with my childhood years.
Sure.
And that's really what starts to set the stage now in 2015 with what I start to become leading up to now.
All right. So you does the department or do you decide to move into this step of healing, or did it all kind of like, hey man, we need you to do this because this is where you're at? How did that happen?
Initially it was very encouraged and supported from all points. My family, by my family, I mean my wife and her family.
Sure.
But the department at the time, which was a different department than my first one, very supportive. And it was a place that really started looking at trauma collectively and realized that, hey, you got a lot of shit, man. Like, they make you fill out this form with like, hey, have you experienced this? Have you experienced that? And I'm like, can I have another sheet?
Right.
And they're like, whoa. Yeah. And I'm like, just being honest here. So
sure.
It didn't, where I was at, it was a form of a retreat and they're doing certain types of treatments, holistic kind of stuff, EMDR, which is like the left brain, right brain processing thing.
Yeah.
And some of it worked. But it ended up leading me to a point where I got the help that ultimately gave me the most amount of growth, the most amount of like open-mindedness and awareness of what I actually had been through and what I needed to do. And that was when I went to McLean's Hospital out here, which is a pretty big psychiatric hospital in this country. And I went through their leader program, which was a first responder based program, and then got set up with a specific doctor who specialized in males, but also first responders, and things just took off. And I was like, holy crap, I can deal with this stuff, and it's okay. Little did I know that there was so much there that it was gonna come back and bite me in the ass again in a pretty big way in 2019. So
so you go to this recommendation that the department goes and they do some good stuff like some EMDR. What else did you experience that might have been kind of like, oh, that kind of helps?
Really, it was the mind-body connection. They pushed a lot of holistical stuff there, and the big thing was like yoga and like acupuncture and like meditation. Yeah. And this was my first taste of meditation was in 2015 at this retreat. Now I let it go. Sure. And I didn't pursue it. But later in life, meditation would become a very important part of my healing, meditation and mindfulness. But it was really this mind-body connection of feeling things that took off in 2015 and kind of continued.
Nice. So when you say the mind-body connection, I'm sure a lot of people think, like the way things feel. And do you think that trauma kind of severs that, or as a coping mechanism, we start to dull that or shut that off to survive? Is that something you think, and I say survive, but, get through or not die sometimes? What would you say?
The physical part is can be more overwhelming than the psychological part. I think there's so much recording our body does in a physical way with trauma. Yeah. That sometimes that becomes so overbearing. And like a perfect example would be like people who get nervous before having to give a presentation in front of a class.
Sure.
Like that.
Public speaking for sure.
Now, for me, I never used to think much about it, right? But now, why do you feel that way? Why are you getting nervous? What is it about talking in front? It can't just be that you're nervous because you're speaking in front of people. It's not necessarily that simple. And for me, I've had instances where I've gotten that because I do public speaking and stuff.
Sure.
And I would get like nervous. I'd be like, why am I getting nervous? Why am I so like, why do I want to cancel this event?
Right.
And so your body, because of whatever event in your past, records feelings. That's why we get like butterflies in our stomach.
Yeah.
And so it was at this point that I started realizing that a lot of the things that I feel now as a full grown man were rooted in events that recorded a physical reaction back, 30 years ago, maybe even 40 years ago at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking into that. I started being like, oh, so it's okay. Because if I can process and replace negative physical feelings with a new positive physical feeling, then these memories become more tolerable. My physical state becomes more tolerable when I get to a point of stress.
Yeah.
And so that stuff really took off for me. And
wow,
I got fascinated with it. And these days I'm just like, I love it. You know, I mean, it blows my mind.
Absolutely. I'm right there with you, man. That is, this stuff is, you know, I've gone through things and had my experiences, and I got to where I am today, and I'm just so curious about, you know, understanding it and demystifying it. And you know, again, the stigma, right? Like, it's not okay for men to talk about emotions or be vulnerable. You know, I don't feel that way, but that's the stigma. And sometimes it's the fear of being judged, or sometimes it's the guy right across from you who's going to say, would you shut up with that? Right. It's not always just this thing that doesn't exist. It literally could be the people you work with. Right.
It often is.
Exactly. So I think that's huge. And, you know, I resonate thoroughly with the sense of feeling the pull to dig into this stuff. And that, again, that's exactly why I'm talking with you today. So 2015, you have this breakthrough, right? Things start to really take hold. And can you tell me about that? Because I'm curious. I am so curious how you got to, something inside you must have switched to make you want to be a coach and an advocate for this type of stuff. But before we get there, how did we get in 2015?
So when I first started getting real help, and I realized that I could heal, is when I really started kind of messing with the idea of advocating about this stuff and telling my story on like social media, right?
Right.
And so I had already started journaling, and all of this became very cathartic. I realized that by me sharing and by me writing, I was healing at the same time.
Absolutely.
And, you know, being vulnerable was always something I was not doing. And by doing so in a kind of a public way, it allowed me to strengthen things. And I hadn't really done a lot. And, you know, I was, you know, like I said, 2015, I'm healing. I'm still doing both jobs.
Right.
The things kind of get dicey. I think people expect me to get better quicker, more whole.
Right.
And unfortunately, you know, that's not how this works. And after, it wasn't even bad calls that got me to leave, but after a bunch of what would be collectively looked at as administrative betrayal, 2017, I was like, you know, I'm not gonna tolerate this anymore. And it became dealing with the functions of the job, and not even like the calls, was getting to be more stressful than having to deal with dead babies and burned up grandmas. It was administrative. It was the rank. And because we just didn't know enough, I ended up leaving, and it didn't feel at the time, but long term, it became a catalyst in the greatest amount of my healing eventually.
Nice.
But it was hard because that was my identity. Go back to when I got on the job. That was my identity. That's all I had. So then I leave, and now it's like, well, who am I as a man?
Right.
Okay, I'm a father. I'm a husband. You know, I was a firefighter. I was an EMT. So there's a lot of was's.
Sure.
So then I struggled with identity.
Wow. Yeah. You basically took a role, right? Like, we all play roles. We all have roles in our lives that we fulfill for ourselves and other people. And you chopped a giant chunk of that off when you decided to leave the fire service, correct?
Yeah. And
how gaping was that hole? Yeah.
It was a huge hole. It was huge. And, you know, it caused some issues. Long term, again, I kind of alluded to 2019 a little bit ago, and Me and my wife has an autoimmune disease. So we were always told she couldn't get pregnant. And so my wife is younger than me. She really wanted to have a kid. So we go through the right channels. We finally get like, yes, you can, you'll just have to be monitored. So we get pregnant in the fall of 2018.
Congratulations.
And yeah, it was great. I already had 2 kids, and now I was going to have another kid that was going to be born after I was, right before I turned, right after I turned 40.
Okay.
So I was like, yeah, start again. Let's do this, right?
Yeah, it's not too late.
So ironically, our due date was originally our 5-year wedding anniversary.
Okay.
We didn't get to it. My wife's a nurse. She went to go into work one night, and she ended up having long story extremely abridged, delivering 6.5 weeks early.
Oh, geez.
And it was a very bad delivery. My wife almost died. The child almost wasn't born. It was, she was bleeding out. It was one of those, at one point, there was a choice being put in my hands of who we save.
Sure, I get it.
This became a very big catalyst in a bunch of trauma that I hadn't dealt with. And that was specifically the death of my first wife. And because now I have, a wife who's healing and ends up going through her own postpartum stuff.
Yeah.
A very young and very early born child. I don't deal with my stuff. I stopped dealing with my stuff. I'm still going to therapy, but I'm not dealing with my stuff because I have priorities now. I'm back into firefighter mode. I'm back into everyone else matters, not me.
Gotcha.
That ends up being a very bad thing.
Okay.
And we get to almost Christmas 2019, a couple of weeks before Christmas, and I have what ends up being my last suicide attempt. And it ends up, trying to word this in a way, it ends up being, in the end, what gets me to stop bullshitting myself and my family.
Okay.
We realize that there is so much more, believe it or not, that Keith hasn't been dealing with. And so we get through that and I get hospitalized. And that is when in 2020, right as the COVID pandemic hits.
Yeah.
That is when I start to make humongous strides in wanting to push to destroy the stigma and to try to make it so other men and women don't have to go through on a long-term scale what I did just because they're on the job. And things just kind of took off.
Wow. That's huge, man. That takes a lot of courage. That takes a lot of brutal honesty. You've been there, you've done that. You're in the middle of treatment. It's not working, but you get to this point where you're like, something has to change. And that's huge. Do you remember how your body was feeling going through this? Do you remember did you have knots in your stomach? Were you like, what does that feel like? And then to one day be like, all right, it's working.
So, when, the 2019-20 window was happening, I just never felt comfortable in my skin.
Okay.
It was whatever you could figure for physical ailments and symptoms I had.
Okay.
And there was a bout with like chest pain a lot of time. Like I get treated for cardiac things that were all fine. I actually don't have a cardiac condition.
Right.
But there was a lot of manifestations that stress was doing. And I just remember feeling awful in my body. But I remember that now that I was taking off with this trauma work, right? I was starting to be like, hey, be more transparent, be more vulnerable, put yourself out there. Because every time you do, you actually have a good outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
I would hold on to it. I would hold on to that feeling. And that feeling was safety. That feeling was, okay, this isn't so bad. This actually is more calming than holding this in and literally feeling like I'm going to throw up all the time.
For sure. Yeah, it's an outlet, right? Literally.
It was a healthy outlet.
Yeah,
believe it or not. And I wanted more of that feeling.
Nice.
I wanted, and it wasn't like a drug. It wasn't like I was trying to numb anything. It was, this is what good feels like. This is what healthy feels like. This is what resiliency. And that's when the first time the word ever popped in my head. This is what being resilient feels like. And I started taking more opportunities and doing more to vocalize mental health.
So you say resilience. I'm glad we're back to this because this is what we really started talking about. And that it sounds like, looking at your story from beginning to end to right now, resilience again, that resilience, it has to be pushed in on, right? It has to be stressed in order for it to exist, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the bouncing back. It's the, I've taken X, Y, and Z, and now I'm pushing back, and here I am back into a baseline. And did you start learning things? Were you being coached? How did you, people don't just wake up and say, man, I'm going to tell everybody about everything I feel right now. Like that doesn't happen very often. So right. How did you get to, these, awakenings, if you will?
I think it was, through doing stuff on social media and writing things, it just sort of, the right networking happened. And one day it was supposed to be in 2020, I was supposed to do a presentation through the New Hampshire Fire Academy, and the pandemic happened and we couldn't be near each other. Right. So they canceled it. And ironically, they scheduled it the next year. Sure. So, here we go. We're beginning of 2021. We're going to start working on this conference in the fall. And they're like, hey, we want you to present. We're going to have another firefighter from New Hampshire present the same day, but we'd like the two of you to try to do something this summer before the conference, like a classroom type thing. And I ended up meeting this other gentleman who, call it fate, call it whatever, right. Who ends up becoming a very close friend of mine. His name's Steve. And, he's a 3-tour Marine and a firefighter medic here in New Hampshire. Okay. And he ends up being the one who reintroduces me to meditation and mindfulness.
Nice.
And, it's kind of funny when you're a guy my size and you have this other sort of badass guy who's, been to war, who's like,
yeah,
hey man, what do you do? Do you meditate? And I'm kind of like,
is this a trap?
You trying to sell me something? What's going on? So, anyway, long story short, that 2021 is really when I first get my opportunity to speak in front of people about my stuff. And I realized a lot of things. I don't know what I'm doing.
Sure. Yep.
When it comes to public speaking, I have no idea. I'm just like, blah, 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 blah. Here it is. And, but I realized the most important part, that I love doing it.
Yeah, that's good.
And it was amazing. My presentation may not have been amazing, but the experience was amazing, and it just catapulted me. And so later that year, in the fall of 2021, I had done a couple things on a public level with advocacy with different organizations, and I get reached out to by a woman, and who's a spouse of a cop, and she's like, "Hey, I'm trying to establish this coaching thing."
Okay.
In the first responder world, I'm like, "All right, what's coaching?" And I had no idea. And,
right.
So we end up kind of partnering up. She puts me through. She kind of coaches me on some things, so I get to experience what coaching is. I'm like, all right, this is good. This can be used as a very good proactive tool,
right?
Sort of puts me through her coaching certification. I become a coach. That was never, and still to this day, really isn't. I have no plans to be a coach specifically. I use coaching with peer support, but the plan was to make me sort of part of her admin team.
Okay. Gotcha.
And so I become director of business development, and then eventually director of promotions, where I'm more with the position I ended up being in. My last position ended up being more of me using my story to help advocate for coaching as a tool. And it sort of just takes off. I start networking more. I start presenting more. I start writing more. And, coaching, to kind of harp on coaching here a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ended up being in conjunction with therapy, ended up being something that got me to get even more out of my comfort zone, realizing that it was just my own fears that would keep me from being successful, for facing things that were allow me to do more of what I enjoy doing, and made me face the answers to the questions I was being asked by the coach, or at that point, I was just self-coaching.
Sure. Okay.
Myself.
Gotcha. So you're being coached and you're going to therapy?
Yep.
Okay. And you're self-coaching and you were coaching other people at the same time, correct?
I never got into actually coaching other people.
Just the presentation.
I do presentations, and then I stuck with the peer support end of things, where I utilize the coaching model and stuff.
Perfect.
And so it just took off, and I just started building on like, I guess, the different coattails. I was like, okay, so I just did this. This is momentum.
Mm-hmm.
Let's keep going.
And it's helping you heal, right? There's something profound about becoming a beginner again at things when you're not good at it, and you are, in the fire service, like your first day, you are afraid to suck so bad. Like you want to do everything perfect, and there's really no way you're going to, because it's literally your first day, and that is, the ego really takes a beating because of that. And right, where when you enter in something that makes you a beginner, even if you've accomplished so many things, you still feel so aware that, man, I cannot dance. I went to ballroom dancing with my wife a while back, and I was like awful in the beginning, and I didn't want to go because it was so uncomfortable to be so bad. And I think there's something very therapeutic about that, and being, like, the vulnerable word, right? Like putting yourself on the stage, putting yourself in front of people at the mercy of them, and then ultimately looking kind of silly because you're a beginner, right? And I don't know, there's something about that. There's something about being willing to take that risk and expose yourself that seems to be cathartic.
Oh, extremely. And I didn't realize how much healing there was in. I've always been a helper. We've all, first responders as helpers. I've always been that helper, but I didn't realize when it came to this part, how much self-help I was giving me by advocating for others. And it really did. It led me to so much more permanent healing.
Yeah.
Because it was sort of, with everything that I do, it was making me sort of face all of it.
Yeah.
And then even at times, like, I'd say something and I would be like, in the middle of a presentation or an interview or whatever, and be like, oh, okay, so I'm going to say this, made me feel a little uncomfortable, not going to get into it. And then I go back and I reflect on it and be like, why did that make me uncomfortable?
Yeah.
What is it about that I couldn't elaborate on? And now I elaborate about things that I would hint at before or not even discuss.
Yeah.
And I realize how powerful it is for those who hear it. You know what I mean? It's very healing for me and them. And it's weird. Life has got a very weird journey.
Yeah. And the power of human connection, I mean, that touches on all the emotions and, empathy and all that stuff. The support system is super important, but you said that it's healing for people to hear this too. And, I never really thought about that aspect of being on a podcast and, just telling a story. I never even considered how it feels for people to hear someone else's vulnerability. That's pretty profound. So thank you. That's cool.
No, thanks for giving me the platform to talk about it. I think it's important for people to hear that we're all human. We all have a story to tell. For most, it'll be in a private setting. For others, if you can get out and talk about it, in front of people, you might be surprised how much healing you're going to get yourself, but others.
That is something I'll write down in my notes. So I appreciate that. So you're in coaching. You're not necessarily coaching. You are helping facilitate. And I think that's kind of where you and I had crossed paths. You were just stepping away from that. What do you have going on these days? It seems like you're busy on the Facebook and the interwebs, putting out a bunch of good content. Where's your direction?
So I always tell people I got like 8 irons in the fire right now, because I'm just all over every part of this that I can be. And so I do, obviously I do like the podcast and the public speaking thing. But I actually got a really good opportunity to be part of 3 documentaries on PTSD.
Awesome.
One of which was sort of my own documentary. It was focused around my life with people from my life that I'll get interviewed. We actually filmed that last year. That was just a really great experience.
Yeah.
Very humbling to hear and be part of a production of hearing other people's stories and seeing real emotion.
Yeah.
It's not scripted.
Right.
It's not like a screenplay. It's real life. And I end up learning even more about myself during this filming of this. So I do that. That's due to come out this fall.
What's that called?
Right now, the tentative name is Coffee and Donuts, ironically, because it's taken off of that first schism.
Okay, nice.
That's sort of the through line with it, and
oh wow,
they have their whole. They're trying to do indie film festivals, and
okay.
the long term is hopefully like a streaming app. So
nice.
That's going on. I'm in the middle still of trying to edit and finish my own book, which is a process.
Yeah,
especially when you have all this information, but. I was asked to be a co-author on another book, which was supposed to be out this past May, but they had to postpone it till September, and that's Scars to Stars, Volume 3.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that's a collection of different, not just first responders, but different people from around the country and essentially the world, with stories of overcoming adversity and trauma and
good
different stuff like that. So that's coming out in September. I write for technically three different, if you will, like magazines online, whatever.
Yep.
So I write for Fire Engineering and Firefighter Nation. And then I also write for a publication through the Firefighter Association of the state of New York, which is called the Volunteer Firefighter.
Nice.
Which I'm going to be honest with you, like the writing thing for me, especially articles, is weird because I coasted through high school on Cliff Notes. And then like college, I wrote like 2 papers maybe. And now I'm like writing articles and I love it. It's something I never thought I would do.
Yeah.
And it's challenging.
Yes.
And you have to go through things and make sure it's worded in a way they're going to want to put it in print and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But I embrace it because these days I'm all about that challenge, and all these things I do can be very challenging. And it's great because there's strength in challenges and facing challenges. And I'm just constantly trying to strengthen the things that I didn't work on maybe back when I should have in my 20s or even teens.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's so I find the same thing happening with me. I went back to school. I'm 38. I'm going to be 39 this year. I'm almost done with my bachelor's degree, and it is. I was a horrible college student. I was an okay high school student. Horrible. College was not my thing. Right. I think I have ADHD. It's probably undiagnosed. Don't really know. And I think it's common in our profession. Something about our job draws us there. And, that's just my opinion. But there's something super interesting going on with me too. I find that I can focus, I can write, I'm reading more and more books than I ever have. Super curious about things. I've looked into spiritual stuff like 7 years ago. That person would have laughed at who I have become because they were so stuck with things. And so that's just super interesting. You say that writing, because I've taken to writing, I'm creating and expressing all these things and advocating in a similar fashion. So that's super curious to me. I'm going to have to look into that more.
I think it's at some age 40. It really is. It's, granted, there's times where I'm ready for like Golden Girls and an shirt and bedtime at 8, but it's something about 40, and I appreciate things now that I definitely didn't. Even my early 30s. Yeah. And writing and this stuff is one of them. And
absolutely,
it's one of the things I'm trying to do is, and I already kind of do with the conferences and the classrooms I do, is develop my own program to take around the country to teach like leadership and resiliency about this, because there's so much strength and trauma. Yeah, there really is. And so many of us go through it that there can be a real good foundation for leadership within this. And I've learned that in the last, again, we're talking about being 40, right? So in the last 5 years of being in my 40s, I've realized a lot of this. And through presenting and talking, I've realized that there's so much potential for the first responder and firefighter lifestyle to benefit from healing and getting strength out of the stuff that we go through.
Yeah, just specifically the fire service and the wellness aspect within firefighterhood has so much potential right now. The walls are coming down. We're having these conversations. There's literally this podcast and all the other podcasts, your podcast, just having these conversations, and really, like you said, people hear it. And, we're reverberating through the ranks, hopefully, and eventually the future, our future fire service, maybe we'll see it, maybe we won't, but it will be, it will be well. It will be a healed fire service. And, I think that speaks volumes for people today, like yourself, being an advocate, sticking their hand out of the black, the darkness, and saying, hey, I helped you, you helped me. Let's make this place a better, for the people coming behind us.
Yeah. I mean, there's, with the younger generation getting in now, I mean, there's potential within 2 generations that having to suck it up may not be a thing. You know? And it doesn't take away the toughness of the job. It's still a dangerous job. It's dangerous differently these days, but it's still a dangerous job. It's still very much a calling. It's not something that just anyone can do.
Right.
We're not taking that away. There's nothing about healing that's going to make this job any less tough.
Right. It's going to be a 10 always.
Always. And you have to be able to do it. And it brings the question, how many people are making incorrect, like, command decisions because of unresolved trauma? Like, how many times is there a decision made that, could result in very bad stuff, And so it's not about lessening the toughness. This is a tough field. You have to be the best of the best to be able to do this. And why not heal to be even better?
Exactly. And that really, what you just said, why not heal to be better? It really goes kind of with, what Priority Traffic Podcast really believes in, and that wellness and high performance are one and the same. And what I've learned from today's discussion with you is wellness and high performance and recovery. It's the same set of tools from context to context, and they bridge the gap, right? It's about it's about bringing the things that we're avoiding back into our lives to become whole again. And, I think your story is super, super important to that, because you blocked some stuff, you had some stuff, you went through some stuff. And now, how would you say your wellness is, today, this healed version of you? Where are you at?
So I always tell people I'm a work in progress. To say that you can fix this is a lie. And you have to constantly work on it. However, my wellness, I'm at a point now where I'm replacing, and this is going to sound like, I don't know, this is going to sound kind of weird. I'm replacing old feelings that were negative, that would cause bad coping or whatever it may be, with new positive feelings. I'm doing it daily.
Nice. And
I'm challenging myself every day to look at why am I feeling this way? Why did I just get pissed off because my wife didn't put the dishwasher together correctly?
Yeah.
Why is that a 10? I look at these things. I look inward. I find out what is that feeling? Where does that feeling come from? And I'm constantly trying to better myself for it. And it's a work. It's a lot of work. It's like going to the gym.
It is.
Like trying to hit that 1 rep max, right?
All the time.
And but it's worth it. Worth it. It's worth it to be alive. It's worth it to be healthy mentally.
Yeah.
It's worth it if you're on the job still and you can do this. It's worth it to have longevity in the job in a healthy way.
For sure. And it does take effort. Like it sounds so easy to just say, well, identify your emotions and tell me how it feels. It's like that, especially when it's tied to your body, like it has been, or it can be, right? We know that feelings and emotions can be tied to our body, and you call it recording, right? So when we have to go through that recording, our body doesn't know it's just a replay, right? So our body gets triggered and fired up, and that takes a lot of effort out of you. Like from my experience, I know that working through things and, discovering and excavating life from 23, 25, 35 years ago is exhausting.
Oh yeah.
And it's, but I think you hit it on the head when you said it's worth it, man.
100% every day.
That's awesome. Well, I've had a really awesome experience talking to you, and I feel like if we kept talking, we could probably talk for another 3 or 4 hours.
Guaranteed.
Absolutely. I would love to have another conversation with you soon. We can discuss that off the air, but I really appreciate you making time to come out and share your story with the audience. And again, in support of June being PTSD Awareness Month, I think this was a great opportunity to raise awareness and maybe, shed a little light on a little bit of something, and maybe allow someone to hear this and inspire some healing. So Keith, it's been an opportunity of a lifetime, and I really appreciate it. Do you have anything you want to say?
No, it's always good to talk about this stuff, and I always am very humbled when I get an opportunity to talk to people I haven't before. So, just pay it forward, folks, and just talk about it. There's really nothing bad about it. It may feel bad in the moment, but it always feels better long term. And so, just keep doing it. Absolutely.
Well, this is Chris. I've been sitting down with Keith Hanks. Again, I appreciate you sitting in on the Priority Traffic podcast. Don't forget to check us out on all the social media outlets, Facebook. We're going to actually put this up on YouTube again. We've been off the map for about 30 days. Schedule's got out of control, so we are back with Keith Hanks, episode 19. Thanks again, Keith. I hope you have a great day, sir.